Hey, welcome to today's webinar regarding NATO's energy security landscape. I'm Alexander Landry, a young fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. IPD is a North American international affairs think tank operating in Canada and the United States. It is dedicated to promoting ideas and policy solutions that support diplomacy, constructive engagement, and prudent realism in international affairs. So obviously, energy security plays an important role in the common security of NATO allies, and the disruption of energy supply affects security within societies of NATO members and partner countries, also directly impacting NATO's military operations. As a consequence to the securitization of energy supplies following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, NATO allies have enhanced consultation on energy security to bolster allied awareness and resilience. Discussion today is going to explore current NATO energy security landscapes, with particular emphasis on recent efforts to enhance strategic awareness of energy developments with security implications. We're going to look to develop its capacity to support the production of critical energy infrastructure, and we'll look at the ensuring of reliable and efficient energy supplies to the military. We're also finally going to examine challenges to energy security from a foreign policy and economic perspective within the alliance. Within this vein, the panel is going to speak to freshly announced NATO Energy Transition by Design, including potential for Canada to assume leadership roles as energy superpowers within the rules-based international order. So with me to discuss these topics are Julius Grubliauskas, Heather Exner-Pirot, Jan Oyedu, and Joseph Kalnan. Julius is Deputy Head of Climate and Energy Security section in the Innovation, Hybrid, and Cyber Division at NATO HQ in Brussels. He currently leads work on the NATO Energy Transition by Design initiative. Heather's a Senior Fellow and Director of Natural Resources, Energy, and Environment Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a Special Advisor to the Business Council of Canada. Jan is the Senior Analyst for Energy Security at NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. He has 10 years of experience in the energy sector, previously having worked for the International Energy Charter Secretariat in Brussels. And Joe is a Fellow and Energy Security Forum Manager at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. His research focuses on the interaction between politics, energy policy, and the international energy systems. I've also already had the privilege of joining him previously on the Energy Security Cubed podcast for CGAI. So I'm really delighted to have you all here to join me for this webinar with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Welcome aboard.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Alex.
So as a lead off, I want to set the scene a little in terms of the domain and energy security and what the topic means to you within the purview of your current work. I know each of you have been deeply involved in energy security for quite some time in many ways. Accordingly, what brought you into the world of energy security and what keeps you working within it even today? And I'll lead off with Heather here. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And thanks for having me with this distinguished group. I look forward to the conversation. So I'll start with just a small personal anecdote before getting into kind of a professional interest. But I grew up in Saskatchewan, and it was at a kind of formative time in my professional life and my career, the last commodity super cycle. So around 2005, 2006, when commodities really start to take off, and really change the economic and also kind of psychological identity of Saskatchewan, where we were kind of farming economy before that, and then we turned into a mining economy. And not only mining, but also about 500,000 barrels of oil a day also. So just watching that, I guess, really feeling the importance of commodities, the importance of markets on these things. And then at the time, my PhD was on Arctic and Arctic security. And so obviously that commodity super cycle had a very dramatic impact on Arctic relations. Before the commodity super cycle, Arctic relations was really about bringing Russia into the fold, cooperation on indigenous relations, on sustainable development. And then again, around 2007, 2008, it became about the race for resources and the scramble, for the Arctic and all those things. And that colored everything that happened in the Arctic. So again, doing my PhD, I was watching all this, kind of from a front row seat of Russia's oil and gas, and also on the Alaskan offshore, in Norway, moving further into the Arctic, kind of Greenpeace's no more drilling in the Arctic campaign, and then the impacts on indigenous communities who both wanted development and also want protection. So seeing it from that angle, and then the commodities bust, where really the prices did not sustain any kind of development in the Arctic. And it lost its flavor internationally, I guess, of that geopolitical importance. And so to come full circle, as you mentioned, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where I think marks the beginning of the next commodity cycle, where we did see a price shock, a commodity shock, where we all remembered, well, we had a great 10 years, of a shale revolution in oil sands and low oil prices and low interest rates. But now things are very different. And we need to think about energy security again because we had really forgotten about it for 10 years. So, that brings me here to today. And like I say, there's almost nothing I like to discuss more than energy security. So looking forward to this.
Heather, well, thank you. I'm very glad you've mentioned Arctic security as well. It'll definitely be a recurring topic as part of the series we're running here, actually on NATO and Canadian implications. Turning on that pivot to Joe, please let us know what brought you into energy security and a little bit about CGAI, maybe.
Well, similar to Heather, I'm a child of the prairies, so I'm from Alberta, born and raised in Calgary, Alberta. So energy has always had a significant, political, economic, and social impact on Alberta as one of the major centers of oil production in the world, not just in North America and not just in Canada. So my approach to energy security came from sort of a policy and commercial perspective. I gained a master's degree in public policy a few years back, and the sort of the perspective that I was taking was very much domestic, local politics and policy, and also the commercial relations there. So I came of age more around the time of the big crash around 2014, 2015 in the oil price. So, very much a perspective formed upon the impacts of that and the question of not only security of supply, but also the question of security of demand for energy producing countries and regions. So I joined the Canadian Global Affairs Institute shortly after the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack in the spring of 2021. And that has had a pretty major impact on the thought and the approach to energy security taken by the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, where it's not just a question of production and supply, but also for sure a question of infrastructure and these new type of hybrid threats that can create big questions over the security of supply, even when you have a perfectly, a country like the United States, which is deeply, self-sufficient where it comes to energy. It can still face these energy security concerns where it comes to things like cyber attacks. So the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, where a foreign policy, defense, and international trade focused think tank, our mandate is focused on promoting a more a larger role for Canada on the world stage, and using public communications with decision makers and stakeholders in order to do so. So further to my perspective on energy security, my first paper published was focused on Russia's manipulation of natural gas supplies in the fall of 2021. So this is before we knew that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, but this was Russia setting the ground for it. Of course, I didn't propose that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, but maybe I should have. All of these things shape my worldview about the vulnerability of the network of countries which share Canadian values and their vulnerability to energy disruptions, such as what Russia has done and such as the Colonial Pipeline hack. And this formed my conviction that Canada, as the largest democratic net exporter of energy, has a responsibility to act and to play a major role in the energy security of our allies and partners.
Thank you, Joe. That's a big piece, and I'm glad you've mentioned that. And there's been publications at length as of late speaking to Canada's role, and especially as a net exporter, what should assume essentially as a role. Pivoting now to NATO, I want to speak to our two panelists that are bringing that insight. So Julius, thank you for coming aboard. I know it's later in the evening right now. Can you tell us about what brought you into energy security and why you're still with it today?
Well, I'm a Lithuanian, so I think every Lithuanian is an energy security expert, really, because it's so closely linked to national security, and energy security is clearly an issue that is so much linked to national security and independence. And I remember clearly from my childhood in 1990. When the Russians cut off energy supplies to try and do a blockade to Lithuania to try to break the resolve of the Lithuanians, that affected the daily lives of every citizen. Having lack of energy, that impacts has a massive social impact, and also had massive cascading effects, like prices increased immediately, jumped, massive inflation and such. I think it's very important to understand that the bad actor, for the bad actors, it's a very tempting target, and you know they could exploit these vulnerabilities, and it's so important to think about energy in a broader sense as an issue that really matters to national security. Otherwise, if we don't take it seriously, if we don't take the resilience seriously, they will try to exploit these vulnerabilities and gain advantage. And today, obviously, many things have changed, and the energy landscape looks much different. But the principles that energy is closely linked to national security and the independence of nations to make their decisions, that still remains true. And we see a massive transformation of the energy landscape today, affecting all areas of life, including the military. So obviously, it's a very interesting, fascinating topic to work on, and I'm happy to delve deeper into it also today.
Perfect. Well, it's a pleasure to have you aboard. And yes, I definitely recognize that piece on Lithuania. Of note, understanding that Lithuania and Vilnius play host to NATO's Energy Security Center of Excellence, which I've had the pleasure of visiting. It's certainly close to the heart and minds of all Lithuanians in that regard. Pivoting now to our last panelist, Jan, I would love to hear about what brought you into energy security from the civilian perspective, and now obviously with NATO, and what keeps you in it today.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening or good morning, everyone from Canada. It's lovely to be here with all of you. So it's very interesting because Julius actually has a security approach to energy from his young age, whereas for me, I started as a banker and I had an economic approach to it. For me, it was always about preserving our technological edge, actually. When you think of us in NATO as the West, 50 years ago, we were the only ones producing cars, nuclear power plant technology, coal power plants that I used to finance in banking and see how, capital intensive they were and hugely important in our economies. They fuel our economies and our ways of life. So that's how I started in energy, looking at the economic side of things, preserving our technological edge. And it's so interesting because we see this constant evolving sector of energy, which used to be about economics, then security, and now even our transition to a decarbonized planet, emission-free, depends on energy. So more and more resources are allocated in this field. And of course, for NATO, the importance of it is increasing. I see mainly three things in energy that matters to us in NATO. So recently, the Russian energy phase-out, the energy transition, and now the potential increasing dependence on China for technology again, because energy is more and more related not to natural resources, but technology. And this is a very interesting aspect that we can all touch upon.
Perfect. I'm glad to have you aboard, and I'm glad you've mentioned that. So now that we've got the panelists introduced, we see it's very evident that everyone comes from very different backgrounds, but we do share some common themes in terms of the approaches to energy security, be they through security themselves, through the economic approaches, through technology. And some of the contrast that I wanted to bring as part of setting this webinar up was looking at Canada and NATO and how they play together. So Jan, I'll pivot to you first, and then Julius, can you share where you think energy security comes into play right now for NATO as an alliance? And we'll talk about the future in a little bit.
Of course. So let me just give you a quick snapshot of our situation today as NATO allies, including military allies, but particularly European military armies. So we have, let's say, lost one important supplier, the Russians. We are in the transition to perhaps also lose another big supplier, the Middle East, Gulf countries. If maritime routes become more and more insecure, we naturally will reduce also our exposure to the Middle East. So this points us to becoming more and more dependent on a single supplier, the US, or perhaps the US, Canada, and Norway, which remains very limited in terms of energy diversification, in terms of resilience of our armies and economies, despite them all being allies. But it also means that we need to secure our routes and our diversification among these three countries, the security of our infrastructure, receiving LNG or oil from Canada, the US, and Norway. And secondly, we need to be sure that we're going to have a security of supply, of production in the US, in Canada. So that's why I was referring to you informally previously about the decision of the US administration to limit future LNG exports and not allocate the same licenses that they used to allocate. Why? Because of environmental concerns. This may not impact us as Europeans immediately in terms of supply, but it sends a wrong message because we are already stressed as Europeans, as you know, in terms of supply options. And so we really need to have the right messages, commitments, investments on the US side, Canada side, and for Norway to sustain our long-term fossil fuel supply, I would say.
And definitely a big piece you were mentioning is the dissonance. And obviously we have the plethora of elections that are coming up this year, which is going to play into that situation. And another piece you mentioned was the infrastructure, which just isn't caught up at the moment. So Julius, I'd love if you could add on that, understanding especially, I know you've worked on the critical energy infrastructure pieces and projects over the past little while. So please tell us about NATO energy security, expand on the infrastructure, and let's hear about the political aspects, highlighting what Jan was just saying.
Yeah, so NATO is a big alliance. It's an alliance of 31, soon to be 32 countries. And among those countries, we have really important, of course, we have the energy consumers, countries in Europe mostly. Then we have important transit countries like Turkey, for example. And we have also important producers, suppliers, be it Norway, but also North America, Canada, and the US are really important producers. So it's a platform for allies to talk also about energy developments and the security implications. And NATO at the moment faces unprecedented challenges to security. One of the biggest in history, namely the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but also more instability to NATO South, and also climate change, which is a threat multiplier. And what unites these countries, be it they are producers or transit countries or suppliers, it's also infrastructure. Because we all depend on reliable and secure infrastructure. So over the past some months, NATO has significantly enhanced consultations on energy security, improved the security strategic awareness. We have regular council discussions. We also talk to the International Energy Agency and European Union, so we can be ahead of the learning curve. But really, one of the more concrete steps NATO has taken was with regard to supporting critical infrastructure security, and in particular, critical undersea infrastructure security. So we established our Center for the Security of Critical Undersea Infrastructure at the NATO Maritime Command, MARCOM. And the ministers, the defense ministers, will meet actually next week, and they will discuss the strengthening of links with industry through a dedicated network, so we can be part of a club that actually is involved in operating infrastructures. We also support Ukraine through coordinating some of the critical supplies to Ukraine. We also work on basically identifying lessons from the Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. These are valuable lessons not only for Ukraine, but also for allies themselves in terms of how can we enhance our resilience. We also organize, for example, training courses for Ukraine for allies as well in NATO institutions. So our military officers have the right knowledge and they are prepared. And we help partners like Georgia or Moldova to prepare against the potential cyber or hybrid attacks against critical infrastructure. So this is really an area where NATO can play its role, including in areas, as I mentioned, that are not on a territory of an ally, but also in international waters, where we also have very important links, be it cables or pipelines that need to be secured. And the third area, so we have sort of three areas of NATO involvement. So strategic awareness, supporting critical infrastructure. But then I think that the one that is closest to NATO core business is ensuring reliable and efficient energy supplies to the military, because now we have an increased demand for our military also on the eastern flank. So we have to make sure that our logistical arrangements and infrastructure can cover the entire alliance and support our military and its needs. We can deliver fuel, energy where it's needed at the right time, in the right volumes. And at the same time, we also have to look into the future. How are we going to adapt to the energy transition, which is transforming energy markets and the way we produce, transport, and use energy? So it's really important for the military also to start about these changes already now.
No, I appreciate that. And the insight provided there is actually excellent. Jan, did you want to add something? Sorry.
I want to add something right now, if I may, because Julius has been doing a great job on this, protection of critical energy infrastructure. But these 2 points are also very important to highlight. So I'll just complement, if I may. Number one, I want to remind everyone that we are not we're not familiar in the protection of undersea critical infrastructure, because we did not used to have wind farms, renewable energy, floating above the sea, so many cables, that many pipelines between continents, between countries. This is a very new area. Whereas on land, we were used to having drones and surveillance systems. So technology is catching up. And that's why NATO also plays an important role. The technology that emerges in the US, in Canada, in France, in Germany, on whether it's sensors or undersea drones. So that's very important for us as NATO to also share among allies. And disseminate. And secondly, these infrastructure, compared to 60 years ago, are not built by nations. They're not built by governments. They're built by the private sector and owned by the private sector. So that brings new other challenges. It means that us as navies, as military, as defense ministries, we need to work more with Google, Amazon, Facebook, all these companies that gather all these data. And so these are very important points to highlight. And third, as Julius mentioned, we are building a new infrastructure that didn't exist before with new technology related to the energy transition. And so we need to be careful in the investment we make. The choice we make determines the next 50, 60 years. Look at the nuclear power plants in France. So the decisions we make today will impact our military resilience in the East, for example, for the next century, for sure. That is why it's so important to work on interoperability, cohesion of infrastructure as well. We're all interconnected in this world, including an infrastructure.
Of course, especially with the globalized piece. So you mentioned that a lot. And it's great that you're mentioning industry and infrastructure. And I'm glad the core task there was mentioned of the reliable and efficient supplies of energy, because we're going to pivot to Canada now. And I'd like to start off with Joe, followed by Heather, to speak to where we see Canada's role as an energy producer in the alliance, what it means in terms of our infrastructure, and how we can play into building that resiliency long term as a nation, as a member of the larger alliance.
For sure. First of all, I'd like to stress that Canada is deeply committed to NATO and to the principle of collective security. So, I have strong confidence in the ability of Canada to react militarily as well as on the economic front where it comes to energy security. In my view, the resource side of what Canada can do for collective security and for its NATO allies is this concept of strategic depth. So if you look at during World War II, Canada was a huge supplier of all sorts of resources that were required to sustain the allies in that war. So for example, Canadian agriculture, metals, chemicals, this is basically half a continent of protected resources that allowed and eased the role of the Allies in winning the Second World War. Now, I think Canada is continuing to play this role. We are the largest democratic net exporter of energy. Now, the United States produces more energy, but of course it consumes a lot more energy. But so we play a huge role in supporting our allies on that front. Currently, we mainly send this energy to the United States. And if you look at total Canadian oil exports to the United States, this is around, I want to say, maybe 4.3 million barrels per day. It could be higher now because Canadian production is continually, seeing how much oil it can send south. That is around, average across the year, that is around 800 super tankers per year. So this is very, very significant energy flows to the United States. And like I think has been said before here, North America is increasingly a central component of European energy security and the energy security of the NATO allies in general. So this kind of North American energy integration, things like the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, things like the Keystone pipeline, absolutely crucial pieces of infrastructure, not just for the energy security of North America, but also increasingly for the energy security of NATO allies. Now, Canada is also doing more to improve its role in the Indo-Pacific. Now, we can look at, for example, the Trans Mountain expansion, which I think we can expect to come online in the first half of this year. It's been delayed several times, and it, of course, is a little bit over budget. I think most people on this might know about that. But the Canadian government has always justified its involvement in the frame of Canada's national interest. And Canada's national interest on this front is supporting our involvement in the Indo-Pacific, supporting our allies as well, our partners in the Indo-Pacific, which also share our values. And now this doesn't have a direct influence on NATO operations because NATO is, of course, North Atlantic, it's not Pacific. But on the global scale, I think we'll see that Canada has a much larger role to play in the total global market, which will have, a stepwise influence on the situation in Europe. So the infrastructure that we can expect to come online with Canada's involvement in the Indo-Pacific, for example, like I said, the Trans Mountain pipeline, the Trans Mountain expansion, LNG Canada. Canada will begin being a major player in global liquefied natural gas very soon. I believe that's 2025. And, something that isn't talked about quite enough, in my opinion, is also Canada's role in NGLs, natural gas liquids, for example, propane, butane, things like that, which are also very important in Asia. And that's the expansions in, for example, Prince Rupert, where we're seeing more and more export capacity there. And lastly, of course, is Canada's role in Arctic energy security and resource security. And I think I'd like to turn it over to Heather to talk a little bit more on that.
Well, thanks for that. What I might want to highlight just to set this up is the very different energy security reality between Canada and now North America and Europe. Whereas North America has become energy independent, Canada always was. But Europe has been as an energy importer, and the United States was until only a few years ago. And how dramatic that has changed global geopolitics, commodity politics, and that kind of thing. So I always say, in Canada, we become complacent. The one thing I'll disagree with Joseph is that Canada's all ready to step up, because we could have stepped up and we haven't been. And there's much more we could do. But it's because we are so complacent, because I think we're the most energy secure country in the world. But we do have the resources, and we could be sharing them with our European colleagues. And I want to point out that, yes, the United States has become, the world's #1 producer of both oil and gas, and the world's #1 exporter of natural gas. And that has been very useful. We all can agree, in the wake of Russia's invasion. But Canada has not stepped up. And there is risk on all sides, from depending too much on OPEC or Qatar or Russia, but also too much on the United States, which I know our European colleagues feel acutely, and we probably don't discuss in North America, that Canada can add diversity to supply. Not only, not to get into American politics, but if there's, between one president and another, adds some risk. But just on the infrastructure, to have a diversity of where you can ship, where you can export from. So Canada can do much more. Shipping on the East Coast, we can. There are projects that were in the pipeline that have been rejected by the federal government and by provincial governments that could be going to Europe. And also, obviously, on the West Coast is more promising. And then I'll just say, we haven't talked about nuclear yet. That is one area where I think, we have tremendous uranium reserves, tremendous. And we are already shipping them, and we already have good relations. And that's one area, as we see the nuclear renaissance, as we see, kind of a repivot towards nuclear, that Canada can provide Europe with the fundamental uranium and uranium fuel resources for decades. Like, I could say centuries, maybe not, but I can promise you decades. And where there's less kind of political opposition to that. So there are many ways. On the Arctic, I have to say, again, the commodity prices are still too low. I don't know, do we appreciate, we all say, oh, we need all these critical minerals and we have all these strategies. Commodity prices are still in the tank, and they are not enough to get Western producers to develop mines. And so I have some ideas on that I can share later. But all of which to say is Canada can and should do more for NATO and for our European allies.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather, on that. That's a big piece. And yes, we will come back to some of those ideas later. We're glad to have you aboard to share those. I will note just quickly for the mechanics of the webinar that there is the Q&A ongoing. So I do see the questions coming in. I invite the panelists to answer by typing if they'd like to, but I know we're addressing some live as we go. So speaking to that, evidently, one of the key moments for NATO and the world when it comes to energy security was that February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, which we're coming up on the anniversary. NATO certainly pivoted into looking at energy heavily after that, and I was involved in that with Julius and Jan. Now we're seeing more disruption in the Red Sea shipping lanes, as Jan's mentioned, and we're seeing tensions in the Middle East that are rising since October 7th, and there has to be thoughts that this has impacts on energy security as well. So Heather, coming back to you, can you tell us what's changed in the domain since October leading into now? And more importantly, what's the next 12 months look like specifically?
Yeah, and I'll answer this briefly. So it highlights the fact that there are choke points that especially affect our European colleagues. Again, for Canada and now the United States, those choke points aren't as big of a deal. And we've seen actually fairly low oil and gas prices. It's been a warm winter in many places. So natural gas is actually very low right now and very affordable, which is good if you're a consumer and not great if you're a producer. But in terms of what's been happening since October 2023, it highlights the volatility, the risk, the reliance. It'll affect Europe very differently than it'll affect North America again. And not only does it affect, OPEC or Middle Eastern supplies to Europe, affects, especially in diesel, we'll probably see a spike in diesel, which has a great impact on the military. But it also affects the ability of Russia on the other side, now that's Armstrong to send product to Europe. This affects its ability to send product to India and to China, which have been kind of the consumers of last resort. So far it hasn't affected prices, but there is a great deal of risk, and there's a deal of shocks, I think. We saw that those short-term shocks following the invasion of Ukraine. No one wants that to happen again. We are just trying to get a tamp down on inflation, and that's very much, the number one thing that will happen. So we have another one of these shocks, inflation will go up again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, that's perfect. Much appreciated. So I just want to pivot now and kind of get some more insight from the NATO piece specifically. So Julius, can you give us some insight into really the Red Sea events and everything that's just going on as of late in terms of what those effects are on NATO? And can you also, one of the questions we have in here is speak to really what the NATO member state reliance on Russia currently still is and what it's looking at moving forward. Like, how are we doing in terms of weaning off that? What's diversification look like?
Yeah, so the Red Sea developments is actually a very clear example why NATO needs to look at the energy developments in a 360-degree approach. And this is what we do at NATO. It's not only about the East, it's not only about the North, and there are important developments also happening there on new shipping lines opening up, and also China and Russia cooperating a lot in that regard. It's not only the West, it's also about the South, because these developments actually impact us all. For the Europeans, when we had the shock of, suddenly a big share of energy removed from the market, meaning the Russian gas supplies that dropped from around 160 BCM per year, billion cubic meters, to like 28 now in Europe. That's quite a difference, right? So that had to be compensated. Also, oil that used to come and diesel and products that used to come from Russia, which means that now we have much longer supply chains. We take energy from further afield. So we imported more to Europe from countries like Qatar, Middle East, all the way to Australia, but also highlights the importance of North America for Europe. And this is why I would like to also stress that energy security is understood in slightly different ways. Hearing also the discussion of the Canadian colleagues, you have for the consumers, it's a security of supply, right? For the producers, it's a security of demand. And I think here, Europeans can actually enhance the security of demand for Canada, and we can partner up, and that increases the importance of the transatlantic link that we have, because this is actually one of the safest and most economic routes compared to the ones that go a long way across the around the Horn of Africa, increasing the prices. But these shocks obviously have effects on the global market, and also highlights the importance for NATO to work in a team also with other players like the International Energy Agency, EU, and also industry, because NATO is not the main actor in energy security. We play a supporting role, but to understand the implications on security of these energy shocks, we have to really play in a team, and this is why it's so useful to have these debates also with other players.
Perfect. No, I appreciate the insight there, and the mention of Canada obviously is one of the stakeholders and players. So really kind of looking at that, actually, I'm curious, speaking to the infrastructure, because it costs time, it takes time, and it costs money evidently to build that. So for infrastructure, we have a question actually I'd like to highlight from the chat. I'll pivot this to Joe first. When it comes to electrical grids and whatnot, are we looking really at centralization and standardization across the board to get this developed? Or is it going to look more like decentralization as an approach for supporting the energy security and getting it set up, especially considering the vast geography that Canada has?
If this is within Canada, I personally am more in favor of large grids that cross the entire country. But for now, I think the fact that it's provincial matter, that the regulation of electricity and planning for it is by far mostly done by the provinces rather than at a federal level. I think we'll continue to see the provinces, planning for their own energy security in the short run and medium term. But in the longer term, I think that there could for sure be a larger chance of a more cohesive and across the board grid. This isn't to say that in certain places, such as, for example, in the Arctic, we're not going to see, a major rise of things like microgrids and distributed energy systems. That is for sure one of the things that people are looking at, including the use of small modular reactors in the Arctic. That is a really interesting thing that many people in Canada are looking toward, especially where it comes to things like military installations up there, beyond the horizon radars. All these sorts of things that require a lot of energy, and would also be great for Arctic communities as well to have more energy security up there. But by and large, I think we're going to continue to see large-scale grids rather than an overwhelming use of distributed energy.
I'm very glad you mentioned the Arctic, and I want to come back to that point. But before we do, I just want to flip to Jan really quick and ask, really, so you're at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, Jan, and it's becoming a war-fighting headquarters now, tip of the spear type approach, and it's looking to get back to that old core business of yesterday for NATO. Can you speak to the operational effects and what really the insights and impacts we are seeing right now from the Red Sea, from Ukraine?
Yep.
How are we juggling that overall in terms of having more than one kind of focus on that right now in terms of energy security?
Yeah. Now, it's very interesting because the Red Sea attacks actually showed the importance of Canada and the US for European allies. I never thought I would be saying this, but the Red Sea is actually very connected to North America for us, for European armies, because there we had one, supply risks, lengthier delivery of different petroleum products for our armies, and second, we had price risks associated that will remain. Why? Because the Gulf region is actually exporting most of its resources to Asia. They are their main customer base, which means that around a quarter of the oil global oil supply produced over there could be disrupted, and this could impact all worldwide energy markets, and which would impact our armies and our costs. So we have the price risk that remains if the situation escalates and deteriorates further. And then we have the supply risk, which means that we will naturally be importing more from North America, from Norway, rather than the Middle East. And this creates also security issues because it strengthens a bit Russia's leverage, let's say, politically. It pushes the Gulf countries into Russia's orbit and China's, their main customer base, which is already shown in their cooperation in OPEC Plus, for example, between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And our military, so what we have, for example, the Operation Sea Guardian, operating since 2016 as NATO in the Eastern Mediterranean, doing what? Mainly supporting maritime situational awareness in the Eastern Mediterranean and maritime counterterrorism. But we cannot operate yet in the Red Sea or further down there unless we have an approval by the NAC. But we could envisage, this is my personal opinion, of course, don't quote me on this, but we could envisage greater cooperation with partner nations for the maritime security of that region. Who are these partners? It could be, Qatar, Kuwait. We already have a research center there that could be doing more work. We have Japan, Korea, the Republic of Korea, who have interest in securing their energy supply from the Gulf, who could work with us. We even outreached as Americans to China to get help for ensuring greater maritime safety in that region. So we see opportunities to actually work more with partners. And as Heather correctly pointed out, we import a lot from the Gulf, different petroleum products like diesel, kerosene, naphtha, and all of these, we used to get it from Russia. So we have successfully, in a way, diversified away from Russian energy supplies by diverting our sources from the Gulf, from Canada, from Norway and the US. But now we're also missing this second option we had, the Gulf. So we will rely less and less on closer providers, as Julius mentioned. Russia, the Gulf, they remained in our orbit, let's say, but North America, is quite a distance. And for our armies, which will require, I underline this, fossil fuels for the next decades to come, our tanks, our jets will continue to require fossil fuels for the next 50 years. We need to have a plan in place for sustainable, accessible, competitively priced, affordable fossil fuels. And that's why we need a long-term plan for the supply of these petroleum products for our military. I'll end there.
Okay, it's excellent. It's definitely the truth, right? Like, we're not weaning off the energy as of yet. There's definitely the reality of the fossil fuels. Evidently acknowledging from the discussion before about climate change, the Secretary General acknowledges climate change is the defining challenge of our time, and we're heavily involved in climate security, environmental protection. That's a little plug for a future webinar to come for IPD. But in that regard, right now, we're still focused on the energy provisions and what we need right now for security. So there is discussion that we've come, and I want to pivot just before we go to energy transition by design. I want to talk about the Arctic a little, and I want to give Heather a chance to talk about some of our solutions. We've seen mention of things like the Northwest Passage, interest of Russia and China in the Arctic. But we've also had that contrast in terms of the Canadian side about talking about lack of infrastructure, low commodity prices, lack of investment. Heather, can you enlighten us a little bit about what Northern energy security means for Canada and what the future looks like for that?
Sure. I think, coming back to the last commodity cycle, people associated the Arctic with oil because there was some we were looking in Alaska, we were looking in Russia and in Norway. The shale revolution made oil so cheap, and the oil sands too, so much investment in oil sands that there is no business case right now for North American oil or natural gas. It cannot compete with shale and with oil sands. So the North American Arctic has become much less important. In fact, oil production in Alaska has been declining, I think, since 1989. You think of Alaska maybe as a major oil producer, but it was really, just meeting that particular need, after the energy crises in the 70s. So this is the good time to talk about critical minerals then. So the Arctic is not going to be the place, I don't think, where we get oil and natural gas. If we are, the barrel's $180 a barrel. It's very bad news around for everybody. But on the critical mineral side, yes, I mean, it's a huge area. There's tremendous geological deposits, but it is for a base metals mine. So for if you're thinking copper or nickel or iron, about 2.5 times more to produce it in the Arctic than anywhere else. And you would love to produce it from the North American Arctic or for Greenland or from Scandinavia because it's friendly. You know, these are friend-shored, friendly allied sources. And we need to diversify supply, but it is still too expensive for commodity prices. And this is the time to talk about China too. You know, we did pretty good getting off of Russian gas. Congratulations to Europe. You did a lot better job than anyone thought was possible. But I think Chinese dominance of minerals and of processing minerals is a much trickier problem. And right now we are deliberately moving to energy systems that depend on Chinese products, whether it's solar panels or wind turbines or electric vehicles and the critical minerals that we need for those. We are moving away from where we are energy independent and fossil fuels and even nuclear to places where we rely on China. And there are real crazy consequences to that. So to get to the solution, we need higher commodity prices. We need better regulatory, better infrastructure to get some of our critical minerals in the Arctic out. There's a Pebble Mine in Alaska, probably the most exquisite copper deposit, undeveloped deposit in the world, was rejected by the Biden administration, I think in the same month that they approved the Willow Oil project. So there's still opposition, public opposition to resource extraction and mining that we have to get beyond if we want to have this energy transition and energy independence. So I have a piece coming out in the Hub, I think this week, which is to look at critical strategic reserves for mines, or for mining products. So we have them with oil. The point of the International Energy Agency in 1974 was to set up strategic reserves of oil. I really think it's beyond time for NATO, for IEA, for the alliance to start having some stockpiles of these critical reserves so that we can influence the market, prevent the booms, prevent the busts, but incentivize some development for friendly producers.
Excellent. Okay. So I see Jan wants to add an answer. I'll just continue to point really just quickly as we continue along that I'm currently moderating still the chat and adding some answers. Yes, we have a limited scope and it's such a wide topic, so I'll provide as much as I can. But there are future webinars coming up on a lot of the side topics we've talked about, like climate security and Arctic security specifically. That being said, Jan, I pivot to you now to follow up on that for Heather.
No, I just want to add that it's so important what Heather mentioned. She's right. And it's very interesting because many make the parallel as we should not fall into the same petro dependency on Russia, on China for the future super electro state. However, one can pivot from one gas oil provider to another. Whereas with China, we cannot pivot to another because there are no rivals. It is the only superpower electro state. So I, as the devil's advocate, wonder how can we possibly match the low production costs China has, the huge volume it produces. Even if we had the reserves, the critical raw materials, minerals, we cannot process them at the price China does, and we cannot produce batteries either, or cars at the cost and price they do because of subsidies and the volume. So we cannot match the volume of a country of 1.5 billion people. And economically, not only in terms of resources, we don't have access to that kind of price. So the question here is, are we ready as the West to pay more and to have expensive energy and cars or batteries in order to produce it locally? And I doubt that will be achievable. I doubt we can have a success story for our climate mitigation objectives if we have to pay a lot more, because you will see that people on the streets are already worried about costs going high. They don't want to pay premiums for climate change, for decarbonization. They don't want to pay triple the price for their cars in the next 20, 30 years. So China is our only solution. And in this current situation, we have to admit that we are focused on Russia. As Heather points out, we kind of postpone the problem of China to the future. As long as we can clean our air, as long as we can do a successful transition, win that Western fight for climate change, that's priority number one. And then I believe we will, like Russia, try to make efforts to reduce dependency. So that's how I see things going forward, but I'm open to everyone's opinion on this, of course.
Just definitely, it's a great point. And again, as I mentioned, climate security is going to come up big for a future webinar. But as in the interest of time, as we're nearing the conclusion, I just want to pivot to Julius to get some insight into that energy transition by design. Although we're not full speed ahead on it right now, I do know that it's part of ending that reliance for NATO member states on the fossil fuels, as you're mentioning, Jan. So it's not definitely the priority per se right now when it comes to security, but it is a key topic. And again, as I mentioned from the Secretary General, climate change is recognized as the defining challenge of our time. So, Julius, can you enlighten us a little on energy transition by design? What does it look like? What can you tell us about it?
Right. So the Secretary General raised this idea that NATO should look at energy transition in a more coherent and coordinated way. And at the Vilnius Summit, allies gave us a mandate to develop a plan for NATO. And now we are finally nearing the end of the development of the plan. And it's very simple, actually. We see energy transition accelerating. And it's happening across the globe, but especially in advanced economies. And just to give you the hint, follow the money. According to the IEA, for every Canadian dollar invested in fossil fuels, you have 1.7 Canadian dollar invested in clean, low carbon energy. So there's a massive investment going into new technologies, new energy sources. And for NATO, it's really an issue of adaptation. The military depends on those energy supplies that come from the civilian world, from the market. And we have to now think more broadly also about the logistics. It's no longer moving fuel from point A to B. It's also thinking, how does it come to point A in the first place? Where does energy come from and in what forms? And we see a number of challenges related to energy transition. It's interoperability, being able to move across the alliance and use the equipment in every NATO country, plug in and use the sources that are fit for the equipment. We also understand that capabilities that we have now, they will last for decades. So some of the sources that the military needs might become more expensive and harder to get. We also see that the networks, the grids become digitalized and more vulnerable to cyber and hybrid risks. And on top of that, indeed, the dependencies of critical minerals, because we are moving from fossil fuel-based energy systems to minerals-based energy systems. So by default, we have this strategic dependency as a risk. However, if we get the energy transition right from the NATO perspective, we have also massive advantages. Less dependence on imports of oil and gas, more production of, let's say, sustainable aviation fuels in NATO territories. So Europeans who are not exactly the biggest producers can benefit from the production. Technological edge, maintaining the NATO's technological edge and exploring innovations. This has always been the strong suit of the military. It's always been at the spearhead of innovation. So all of these new technologies can actually bring operational advantages, for example, from electric bikes that special operations can use, and they are quiet and can move without the heat signature, to submarines, diesel submarines that can use air-independent propulsion, hydrogen, and can stay submerged longer. So we are now addressing NATO adaptation in a more coherent manner through basically phases. We need to understand the trends with dialogue with industry. We have to look at the best practices from Canada, from France, from the UK. What are the best practices also adopting these new technologies? We have to track the innovative technologies much better, understand what do they mean for the military. Second, we need to assess the security and military implications of the energy transition. And this is where the military colleagues are working on, but also our security colleagues from intelligence, for example, how Russia and China are adapting also to the energy transition. That we need to understand very well. And then the third step is to understand what can we do about these findings? How can we address it through standardization across the alliance? NATO strong suit is the standards that apply to every member. Then exercises, technology demonstrations, pooling capabilities from potentially stockpiling to microgrids that we use now more and more in the military, future-proofing our capabilities, and finally, what's really important, sending a demand signal to industry, because we have to also understand that the military has not the strongest voice in the military about the demand. But if we are coordinated together, we can tell in a more articulate way what kind of energy we will need in the future in the military domain so the industry can adapt.
Perfect. Yes. So definitely taking energy transition by design, subsidiary products like, projects such as the NATO Operational Energy Concept, which I know Natural Resources Canada is involved with, looking at the different initiatives, such as working with the Conference of National Armaments Directors and their symposiums on climate resilience, energy transition, and whatnot. These are all key pieces. So for the penultimate question, I do want to just pivot and ask Joe and then Heather, considering this project for energy transition, what do you think it means for Canada specifically? Do you see a role for Canada to play in this project in a leadership position? And what does Canada's own energy transition future look like domestically, considering the NATO advancement?
Okay, well, I suppose I'll go first. I of course think that Canada has a very strong role to play. It is currently playing a very strong role in the energy security of our NATO allies and our partners around the world, specifically where it comes to the energy security of the United States, which extends across the Atlantic and to the Indo-Pacific. But I think we should emphasize that the traditional energy system will not disappear in a day. The climate change, of course, makes it imperative that we do reduce our emissions. Reduce emissions globally, in fact, is very, very, very important. But the role of Canada in the short term and medium term, I believe, is to firm up this traditional energy system. In the longer term, of course, Canada has a major role to play with our strong history of understanding nuclear technology, our ability to export hydrogen, and of course with critical minerals, which will all be very, very important. But in the short and medium term, it is crucial that Europe can maintain its industrial base. In my view, the economic health of the European Union and of the United Kingdom and of all of our European allies and partners in NATO is under a severe amount of strain. I think statistics have been coming out of Germany that show that their energy-intensive industrial production has dropped significantly, very significantly, and with it, the industrial production in general is under threat. So the importance of Canada, of course, is in maintaining these bonds across North Atlantic to support our allies in Europe. And then also consider with big consideration for our partners such as Japan and South Korea as well, which both face major energy security challenges with their tie-ins with, for example, the Sakhalin-2 energy project, as well as Arctic LNG in Russia, both of which are very important pieces of their energy security, but are under threat because Russia has become a very disruptive actor on the world stage. On that front, the Indo-Pacific will also take a very long time to transition. So, long story short, while Canada has a major role to play in future energy technologies, the current energy technologies are, in my opinion, the priority.
Perfect. I just want to pivot to Heather and then Jan, coming right back to you.
Yeah, so I'll be very brief so we can get to Jan, but Canada is very blessed. We're the second largest country and only have 40 million people. We have world-class reserves of uranium, of oil in the oil sands, of natural gas in the Montney and Liard. And we have a responsibility. If you look at, oil reserves in the world, Canada is the only one in the top 10 that is a democracy that has reserves of that side. And we haven't, for me, the elephant in the room is what happens when shale plateaus and declines and the United States isn't energy independent anymore. And I think we need to look serious at that. And there's a real responsibility for Canada to keep being a producer of oil and gas as long as our allies need it. The risk is that we might have stranded assets. We should accept that risk because it's much better than them not having enough energy for the economies and for NATO. So Canada can and should do much more. And I expect that we, hopefully we'll turn around at some point and do our part.
Thank you, Heather. I'm going to pivot to Jan now. And just really as we wrap up here, because we're coming to the end of our time, I'm going to go around the table once more to see if you have anything all to add as parting items. So Jan, I'd like to start with you.
Yes, thanks, Alex. I just want to echo what Joe said, because that's really critical for you North Americans, let's say, to understand us Europeans. Our business model in Europe has failed. This was based on importing cheap fuel from Russia to our energy intensive industries to produce high value products, from cars to nuclear power plants, all kinds of industries, and make money from that with the added value by selling expensive goods worldwide. Now we have lost our technological edge. We have lost the cheap fuel from the Russians, which is why, as Joe correctly pointed out, we're losing our industrial competitiveness. And this energy transition by design, in our opinion, kind of allows us to regain, perhaps, potentially, our technological edge and become competitive again. But for that, we of course need to produce the energy transition industrial components and technology in Europe, so that we don't become dependent on China, but also we develop new jobs, new industries on clean energy sources in Europe, which is why we have the Diana project and we finance innovation. Secondly, Canada and the US will become more and more important in this transition for us European allies, and perhaps our energy relations may change with these two allies. Perhaps we could have a more privileged, more advantageous relationship. Now, it may sound a bit crazy what President Macron had said a few years ago when he said maybe we should buy LNG from the Americans at this special, subsidized price for us Europeans, because we're predominantly going to buy it from them. So in a market-based world, in a world where American private sector companies are selling this gas, not the Russian Gazprom state-owned company, this doesn't make sense. But I also kind of envisage that the energy relationship can evolve between Canada, the US, and Europe into, I'm not sure what kind of framework, but a more, let's say, privileged, special relationship, just like we are evolving in the trade area. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'll finish third by saying that the civilian world is moving very fast, but don't forget about us, the military. We don't want to be party poopers, but we are slower because our technology, our vehicles will rely inevitably for the next decades, maybe half a century at least, on fossil fuels. So we need to access fuel everywhere. I'll give you an example. In Norway, for example, where electrification is really advanced of their economy, energy systems, and vehicles, the government has to subsidize some gas stations in very remote areas in Norway, so that you have gas stations there. Otherwise, the military vehicles will never be able to find fuel in those distant areas of Norway. So this is something we need to think of and preserve and make sure that for interoperability and our resilience, deterrence, we continue to provide fuel at affordable prices and accessible locations all around across the alliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the insight there. Very well said. And thank you for mentioning Diana. Definitely, we know one of the key topics for the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic is going to be looking at energy. So it's something to come. And that's really looking to link up that technology basis from industry and startups and whatnot, and those military aspects, considering the lag. Over to you, Julius. Do you have any final thoughts for this panel after the great hour we've had today?
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a really, really interesting discussion. And just to reiterate what Joseph also laid out, we need to have now all sorts of energy. Energy markets are quite tense still. So we need in the short term, indeed, the supplies of oil and gas from North America. And we need to also look at adapting to the future into innovative technologies through also Diana. We have the energy resilience challenge in the Diana, promoting the startups and new technologies and such. We have to make sure that these two sort of types of energy systems can work in tandem. That's really, really important also for NATO, where we look at everything through the lens of interoperability and standardization. And just to finish, where I started in Lithuania, we have the Center of Excellence of NATO on energy security. And Canada has recently established the NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, I think that the partnership between these two centers is going to be fantastic, and it will produce everything that we need for the proper energy transition that combines and aligns all the aspects of energy. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you so much for coming aboard with your insight, Julius, especially from NATO headquarters, complimenting there from SHAPE for Jan. The mention of CASCO, so the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence, I'm really glad you did. And for the viewers and listeners, we're going to have future webinars that's going to specifically talk about climate security. And we're going to have people, hopefully, from CASCO and the Climate Security Association of Canada to discuss that. On top of that, just pivoting now, Joe, any final thoughts for the panel?
Sure, yeah. A few months ago, back in December, we had Daniel Jurgen on our Energy Security Cube podcast, and something that we asked him is about whether energy is more of a political or a commercial matter. And of course, he said it's both. And if you look at the history of energy, it's always been both. But I think we need to be a little bit more considerate about where it should be completely commercial, where it should be political. I think there's certain parts of the energy system that we've all agreed that should probably be under heavy regulation, such as electricity and pipelines, things that do not operate that well without sufficient regulation. But where it comes to future energy technologies, when we're looking at critical minerals and things like that, and pulling off industrial policies where it comes to these sorts of new technologies, we have to be really careful about making sure that these policies are fit for purpose. Where it comes to our, for example, critical minerals lists, every year it seems as though these critical minerals lists get longer. And I don't think it is very effective when you're saying that half of the elements on the planet are critical minerals. You need to have something that is very focused and very built with the actual goals in mind that you have. So, Jan, when you were talking about our competition with China, we need to pick our battles. We need to determine where we can win and where we can devote our resources, and where it's very important for us to devote our resources into the future where it comes to our industrial policy. And I feel like industrial policy that we've seen in the past few years has been taking far too much of a scattershot approach where it should be very, very focused.
Perfect. Thank you again, Joe, for the insight for the Canadian piece and for being aboard today. Heather, final thoughts to you before I wrap it up.
Final thoughts, and I'll be optimistic. So, just for Jan's point about diesel in the military, you cannot overstate the usability of diesel in these remote cases where logistics are everything, where you don't have infrastructure. It's storable, from -40 to +40. And so there might always be a need in some circumstances with remote or lack of infrastructure for diesel, and to look for net zero and not just elimination of everything that's bad. But on the positive note, I am very bullish on nuclear. It does fit purpose for industrial purposes. It can do industrial heat now with the new 4th generation nuclear. The Western world is energy independent with nuclear. We have the entire supply chain. In Canada, we're almost fully energy independent on nuclear, and certainly Europe with Canadian or Australian uranium is energy independent with nuclear. So we do have a great option to get off fossil fuels in the next 30, 40, 50 years, but it'll take some time. We'll always need hydrocarbons for plastics and chemicals. And so we just need to be, again, some pragmatism. And I just encourage my European and NATO friends to remind Canadians that you need our resources, because we don't hear it here. And I think we need to hear it more, that we'd be letting you down if we didn't continue to export these things.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much for being aboard. Really, so energy security, there we have it, an hour and 10 minutes speaking to this. Evidently, we didn't come across any solutions, but I think we fostered discussion, which Heather mentioned, needing to happen among NATO between Europe and North America when we're looking at that. One item I always come back to is really within NATO, Article 2 speaks to the economic cooperation that's required. It's colloquially termed the Canadian Article for a reason, as it's Lester Pearson that really pushed the buck and ensured that it was included as part of the original Washington Treaty. And it's ironic a little bit that we're coming up to the Washington Summit 75th anniversary of NATO this coming summer. That being said, we could have spent a full day. There are conferences that get spent on this topic, but rest assured, there are many more topics of this type and this taste with many of the same speakers to come over the next many months with IPD specific to NATO and Canadian implications. For all the speakers here, thank you again for coming on this webinar. the community is immensely richer in knowledge here today based on your contributions. For the guests and viewers, we hope you've taken something away from the webinar today, and we remain open to fostering further discussion pertaining to the items. So recording here is going to be posted both to IPD's website and YouTube. You can also further engage online through the website, as well as various other forums, such as CGAI's Energy Security Forum. We're looking forward to having you back for future webinars. And it's been a pleasure today to host and moderate with the excellent group we've had here today. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.